This is a map of South America today, and this is a map of South America in 1860. Looks similar enough, right? But look closer at the Pacific, and you'll notice something's missing. Bolivia used to have a Pacific coastline. This wasn't just a border, it was a gateway to economic vitality. The Bolivian highlands were overflowing with silver and tin. The mines around the city of Potosí churned out far more precious metals than the Bolivians could ever use, creating a fantastic opportunity for exports. But there was a catch. Exporting eastward was a logistical nightmare. First, you'd have to cross the Eastern Cordillera, one of the toughest regions of the Andes Mountains. Then came the Amazon lowlands. Hot, humid, full of danger, and practically impassable, river transport offered no relief, as 19th century ships couldn't navigate the Rio Mamoré with any reliability. But the rugged east wasn't really a problem for Bolivia. With the Pacific coastline, the Bolivians built efficient rails, connecting the mines to the ports. From there, Bolivia's silver and tin easily flowed to foreign markets. The system worked well. Mine in the highlands, transport to the coast for export, tax the trade, and continue to build the nation. In the 1860s, Bolivia was more than just viable. It had the potential to become a major power player in South America, but in 1879, Bolivia lost its entire coastline, and its economic future with it, all over a dispute involving bird poop. To understand this, you need to understand what really fueled 19th century economies. It wasn't steel, coal, rifles, or even gold. The 19th century was fueled by something you see every day: plants. If you're alive right now, thank plants. You eat them, or you eat animals that eat them. Either way, no plants, no life. But in the 1800s, plants didn't just feed people, they fed entire economies. No cars meant you rode a horse, and that horse runs on hay. No tractors meant you hitched a plow to cattle, donkeys, or buffalo, each one fueled by calories from plants. And it didn't stop at food or transport. Before oil and synthetics, plants were the raw materials for just about everything. Strong rope was made from hemp or cotton. Durable trade ships were built from timber, sealed with tar from pine trees. Medicine came from distilled herbs, bark, and roots. And if your country wants to lead the Industrial Revolution, you'll need lots of rubber belts to operate the heavy machinery. And rubber is made from latex, which can only be found in plants, as synthetic rubber hasn't been invented yet. In the 19th century, plants meant progress. Nations didn't just eat them, they built their economies on them. The 1800s had an insatiable demand for plants, but it lacked supply. The world needed plants. But the plants needed fertilizer, and there wasn't enough to go around. To grow, plants need 3 macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Phosphorus and potassium are the easy ones. If a farmer over-fertilizes with phosphorus or potassium, the nutrients can remain in the soil for a reasonable amount of time. But nitrogen possesses a unique challenge. Regardless of application rates and what the plant consumes, nitrogen will volatilize into a gas and literally float out of the soil into the atmosphere. Nitrogen is also highly soluble, meaning too much rain can wash nitrogen away from the roots of the plants, far more so than the other macronutrients. Nitrogen loss remains a challenge for modern-day farming, but today we have cheap, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. It can literally be produced anywhere in the world. But the people of the 1800s didn't have this luxury. The only option for nitrogen was organic. It was expensive, heavy, deposited randomly around the world, and farmers could never seem to get enough of it. Experts started calling this dilemma the nitrogen crisis, because that's exactly what it was. So many people and economies to feed, but so little nitrogen to feed the plants. And the consequences were brutal. With no synthetic fertilizer, food was insanely expensive. The typical working class family spent about 60% of their income on food. While most of the world was starving for nitrogen, Bolivia had an abundance. Bolivia's coast was along the Humboldt Current. This cold water stream would bring in nutrient-dense water from the bottom of the ocean. The nutrients attracted plankton, which attracted fish, which attracted millions of seabirds. And those birds settled right along Bolivia's coast, long before Bolivia even existed. For centuries, birds flocked to this region, ate their fill, and did what birds do best: poop. Lots of it, piling up year after year into thick layers of what locals call guano. And guano is a highly prized, nitrogen-rich fertilizer. But the seabirds aren't the only factor. The Bolivian coast was also part of the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on Earth. That dryness was crucial. In a wet climate, nitrogen from the guano would volatilize, and the guano would wash away during heavy rains. But in the Atacama Desert, the guano cured perfectly. Very little nitrogen was lost in this climate, and the guano just kept accumulating for centuries. Some deposits reach 50 meters deep. And guano isn't just any fertilizer. Seabird guano is prized for its nutrient density, even by today's standards. It is rich with both macro and micronutrients that plants love. Crucially, the guano from the Atacama Desert was rich with nitrogen due to the dry climate, and Bolivia's nitrogen abundance didn't end there. Near the port city of Antofagasta, the country also held massive deposits of sodium nitrate. Unlike guano, it had a dual purpose. You could feed crops with it, or mix it with sulfur and charcoal to make gunpowder. But this nitrogen abundance would not launch Bolivia into economic greatness. Instead, it lit the fuse for disaster. The problem started with maps. Spanish colonial officials had a habit of being creatively vague with borders, especially in places they didn't care about. And in the 1700s, nobody cared about the Atacama Desert. It was dry, desolate, and far from profitable. But after decolonization, the nitrogen crisis arrived. That barren stretch of coast transformed into one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on Earth. Guano meant wealth. Guano meant prosperity. Guano meant power. And both Bolivia and Chile claimed it was theirs. To avoid a war over the guano, the two countries agreed to draw a line at the 24th parallel. Bolivia took the north, and Chile took the south. But the zone between the 23rd and 25th parallels was different. It would be a shared tax zone. Export duties from this zone would be evenly split, regardless of which nation controlled the area, a reasonable compromise to prevent war and share the wealth. But Chile and Bolivia aren't equals. Chile was world-renowned for its mining expertise, a reputation that still holds today. It had the knowledge, the infrastructure, and British capital to extract guano at scale. Over time, Bolivia allowed Chilean firms to cross the border and set up operations. It didn't take long for Chilean companies to dominate Bolivian territory. Tensions rose. Bolivians watched as foreign companies got rich off of their resources. In an attempt to restore balance, a new compromise was reached. Bolivia would now collect all the export duties from the guano. In exchange, they made a critical promise. No new taxes on Chilean companies for 25 years. That promise became the spark that lit the fuse. A single tax dispute would unravel the deal and set the Pacific coast on fire. Things were not going well in Bolivia. Nationalist sentiment was rising fast. Watching Chilean companies, backed with British money, extract Bolivian resources enraged the population. Even worse, Bolivia was teetering on financial collapse. The government desperately needed cash. And the global nitrogen crisis worsened in the 1870s, making guano all the more valuable. With guano's increasing value, Bolivia no longer saw the old agreement as fair. In defiance of the treaty, they raised taxes on Chilean companies. The increase? About 10 cents per 100 pounds of guano, a tiny amount. Surely the Chilean companies would understand and not make a fuss about this tiny tax raise. But Chile was infuriated. The size of the tax didn't matter. A deal was a deal, and Bolivia was breaking a treaty that they agreed to. Chile demanded international arbitration, but Bolivia refused. They called it a domestic matter. It was Bolivian land after all. One major Chilean firm flat out refused to pay the tax, claiming it was illegal under the 1874 treaty. So Bolivia struck back hard. They revoked the company's licenses, sent in the military, and seized the company's mine. To discourage future defiance, Bolivia announced it would auction everything off on February 14th, 1879. On auction day, Chile didn't send lawyers or diplomats. They sent warships. Troops stormed the port city of Antofagasta and shut down the auction. From Chile's perspective, this wasn't war, this was enforcement. They were simply upholding the treaty that Bolivia had signed. Bolivia didn't see it that way and declared war on Chile. But they weren't alone. Bolivia had a secret defensive pact with Peru, and since Chile technically invaded Bolivia, Peru was now dragged into this war. But unlike Bolivia or Chile, Peru had a weak sense of nationalism, a factor which would lead to its own ruin, but we'll get into that a little bit later. With the arrival of war, far more was at stake than meets the eye. Yes, it began with boundary lines, taxes, and guano, but the real story was much bigger. This war wouldn't just settle who controlled the guano, it would decide who controls the Pacific coast. The winner wouldn't just walk away with fertilizer, they'd walk away with ports, power, and regional dominance. The economic and political future of all three nations was at stake. With these high stakes, it earned its name, the War of the Pacific. But before we get into that, I have a very special announcement to make. I am currently undertaking the most ambitious project of my life, fatherhood. In the middle of writing this script, my daughter was born. So if you'd like to help me and my family with this next adventure, and to keep the videos coming, consider becoming a patron by following the links below. Every bit of support makes a huge difference. And if that's not your thing, liking and subscribing goes a long way too. Thank you, and now back to the War of the Pacific. After Chile seized the port of Antofagasta, any hope for peace quickly evaporated. The discovery of a secret alliance between Bolivia and Peru only made things worse. Peru was one of South America's major powers, and its alliance with resource-rich Bolivia made Chile feel surrounded. Chile was already experiencing border tensions with Argentina, and with Peru becoming a new rival, Chile was very concerned about its place in South America. Losing the war was not an option. Its very survival was at stake, and Chile was badly outnumbered. The Peru-Bolivian alliance fielded an army twice the size of Chile's, so brute force was off the table. If Chile wanted to survive, they had to outthink their enemies, and that meant turning South America's rugged, unforgiving geography into a secret weapon. The Atacama Desert, though rich in mines and ports, was practically uninhabited. No farms, no major roads, barely any rail. The terrain was so harsh that movement by land would be painfully slow. Movement by sea, on the other hand, would be much quicker. Chile understood that the war would not be won by boots on the ground, but by ships in the water. And this was a big problem for Bolivia. Chile and Peru had modern navies, which included ironclads, the armored warships that had redefined naval combat in the US Civil War. But Bolivia had no ironclads, and only a few outdated ships. Worse yet, their biggest port had already fallen in the first few days of the war. From day one, Bolivia had no chance of winning control of the seas. Without control of the ocean, their troops would always move slower than the other players. So the Chilean Navy sailed north to face the Peruvians and take the Pacific for good. In the opening sea battles, Chile quickly proved its naval superiority. You see, the Peruvians were relying on ironclads that were already about 15 years old, a few of which were bought from the United States after their Civil War. Peru had a fantastic naval fleet, but Chile's was better. Chile had great relations with the United Kingdom, and before the war even began, Chile purchased new, state-of-the-art ironclads from the British, and this technological advantage was decisive. In just a few months, Chile was able to control the entirety of the Pacific coast. With control of the Pacific, Chile faced a strategic choice. Advancing into Bolivia didn't make sense. Bolivia's key cities were high up in the Andes, fortified with intimidating mountain peaks at dizzying high altitudes. This is where supply lines go to die. Instead, Chile turned its focus onto Peru. If Peru was hit hard enough, it could break the alliance. The plan was to force Peru to sue for peace, isolate Bolivia, and Chile could claim victory. With naval superiority, Chile could launch a direct assault on Lima, Peru's coastal capital, a potential knockout blow which would force Peru out of the war quickly. But there was another option. Chile could get a nice war trophy first. Peru controls part of the Atacama Desert too, regions that are also rich with guano and nitrate that were quite profitable for Peru. But Chile controls the seas now. It would be so easy to liberate some of these resource-rich lands into Chilean control. Sure, this would lengthen the war, but there was a prize to win, and that prize was guano, and Chile wanted that prize. Chile struck fast and sharp, hitting Peru's southern coast with one of the first amphibious assaults of the industrial age. Peru and Bolivia mounted a fierce resistance, even winning key battles. But it wasn't enough. Chile controlled the seas, offering superior, faster logistics. And logistics win wars. The Peruvian-Bolivian army couldn't match Chile's pace. They were stuck playing catch-up while Chile leapfrogged up and down the coast, striking wherever they pleased. In just over 6 months, Chile was able to capture 3 provinces from Peru, each loaded with guano and nitrate. For Bolivia, it was humiliating. Their entire army was essentially gone, and internal political divisions consumed the nation. From this moment on, Bolivia would have little military involvement in the war. Their armies were defeated, their leaders in disarray. Peru was left to fight on its own. But then the fighting paused. Instead of advancing, Chile decided to fortify their new lands. More troops arrived, supply chains were improved, and of course, mining of the precious guano began in earnest. After all, Chile had a war to fund, and guano was still selling at a premium. During this lull, there was a chance for peace. The United States stepped in as a mediator, trying to get all 3 sides to agree to peace. Chile's position was clear: let us keep this new land, and the war is over. But Peru and Bolivia refused. They would not surrender their guano-rich lands, despite Chile's logistical superiority. The peace talks failed, and this was fine with Chile, as they were already planning their next advance. It was time to deal a death blow to Peru. It was time to conquer Lima, and when Chilean forces reached the capital, Peru would start fighting itself. Now is a good time to mention how Peru was actually set up as a country, because not everyone living in Peru considered themselves to be Peruvian. The true Peruvians were descendants of the Spanish, some of them pure Spanish, others mestizo. In addition to the Spanish descendants, there was a large indigenous population who weren't really equals in Peruvian society. The indigenous were treated poorly, pushed to the margins, and in many cases enslaved through abusive debt laws. And it didn't end there. Peru was home to a large Chinese population. Some of the Chinese were immigrants, others were forced to Peru as slaves. Some of the Chinese prospered in Peru society, but most were forced to work as slaves in Peruvian guano mines and cotton plantations. The hierarchy was clear. Spanish blood ruled, and all of the hard labor would be assigned to the natives and Chinese, whether they liked it or not. These conditions created a weak sense of nationalism in Peru. From the perspective of the natives and Chinese, they weren't really Peruvian. They were slaves to the Peruvians. Chile was fully aware of Peru's internal racial tensions. Officers were ill-educated on the subject, and led their soldiers accordingly. Chile was at war with Peru, not the Chinese, and not the natives. They were not to combat these 2 oppressed groups, and could even present themselves as liberators. But these orders were followed to a mix of degrees. In some cases, Chilean soldiers would abuse natives. In other cases, Chilean soldiers freed Chinese slaves from working in the mines and plantations. Some Chinese even volunteered to join the Chilean army upon liberation, and this played a crucial role in Chile's strategy. Chile began to make amphibious landings around Lima, preparing to march towards the capital. Chile broke through Peru's defensive lines. The battles were fierce and brutal, but an intact Chilean army was now marching straight towards Lima. Panic gripped the capital. What would happen when the enemy arrived? There were rumors, ugly ones. The Chileans looted with abandon in the smaller towns leading up to the capital. Entire towns would be ransacked when the Chilean army arrived, complete with decapitated statues. In some cases, Chilean soldiers killed each other over stolen goods. Now they were coming for Lima, and when they arrived, the city erupted. Soldiers were angry, battle-worn, and resentful towards Peru, and they took their anger out on civilians. Despite their orders to remain peaceful, widespread looting began immediately, and Lima went up in smoke. The Chinese and natives saw their chance. Some escaped bondage, others joined the chaos to get revenge for years of oppression. Armed gangs roamed the streets of Lima. Even Peruvian soldiers joined in the looting of their own city. Residents would arm themselves and defend their homes from rooftops. Conditions became so dire that Lima's mayor did something unthinkable. He begged a Chilean general to restore order. The general agreed, and the war had to be paused to end the chaos. The general sent his most disciplined troops to help restore order. The mayor recruited an urban guard, full of Peruvians, Chinese, and foreign residents. Order returned in the following weeks, but the looting didn't stop, it just became more organized. The Chilean army continued to loot, but in a much more organized and less destructive manner, all under the direction of officers. This wasn't uncontrolled pillage, but rather the systemic removal of Peruvian treasures. Animals at the zoo were taken, precious artifacts at museums were packed up and sent to Chile, prized artworks were removed from their frames and sent south. to new museums in Chile, the sacking of Lima remains a sensitive topic for both nations. To this day, Peruvian and Chilean historians argue who was to blame and what was lost. If there is any consolation for Peru, it was this: the war should be over, the capital was occupied, surely there was nothing left to fight for. But the fighting wouldn't stop, and instead became more intense. When Chile initiated peace talks, they made one thing clear: the Guano-rich province of Tarapacá was off the table. It was now a part of Chile, and would be so forever. The other provinces were up for negotiation, but Tarapacá was now Chile's. Peru refused. Tarapacá was far too valuable, too profitable to let go. Giving it up would be like amputating a limb. So instead of negotiating, the Peruvian president fled Lima, retreating to the mountains to lead a resistance. The president believed, perhaps naively, that he could get the United States to join the war and fight for Peru. Meanwhile, Chile was tired of fighting and wanted the war to end. Capturing Lima drained their forces, and supply chains were starting to stretch thin. But with no Peruvian president to negotiate with, Chile came up with a workaround. They would install their own leader. Meet Francisco Garcia Calderón, a respected Lima politician. Chile installed him as the new leader of Peru for the sole purpose of legitimizing Chile's new territorial gains and ending the war. But Calderón refused to be a puppet and chose patriotism over personal power. Instead of signing away Peru's lands, he rejected all of Chile's offers. Frustrated with their disobedient puppet, Chile arrested him and had him imprisoned. This left Chile in a terrible predicament. They had captured the enemy's capital, but the enemy refused to surrender, and then things got really messy. With the fall of Lima, Peru's government fractured. Resistance splintered into different factions, some of which started fighting each other. Peru's resistance against Chile is wildly complex, but there were two key generals who commanded their own power base. This is Miguel Iglesias, a wealthy aristocrat and hero of Lima's defense. After the capital fell, he retreated north and continued to fight Chilean forces, and even achieved some key victories. He had the money, the military chops, and the backing of Peru's upper class. But his main rival was cut from a different cloth. General Andrés Avelino Casares was different than most Peruvian generals. He was mestizo and proud to be both Spanish and native. He spoke fluent Quechua, Peru's most widely spoken native language. He promised the natives a better future after the war, and they rushed to volunteer in his resistance movement. Casares ran a brutal, effective guerrilla campaign that frustrated Chilean forces at every turn. They started calling him the Wizard of the Andes. While Casares and Iglesias opposed Chilean occupation, they also opposed each other. The two generals had very different views of what Peru would look like after the war. Iglesias wanted the old order restored, where the elite upper class would be mostly of Spanish blood. Casares was more egalitarian. He dreamt of a Peru where bloodline didn't matter, a Peru where native, Spanish, and mestizo would be equals. Eventually, the two men turned their weapons on each other, and Peru teetered on the edge of civil war. Chile didn't care about Peru's internal squabbles. They just wanted to get out of this war with their newly acquired guano mines, but they needed Peru to have a legitimate leader to sign a peace treaty that would last. The clock was ticking. Chilean troops were dying by the day. War costs were mounting, and fighting guerrillas in the Andes was a nightmare compared to traditional battles. So Chile escalated. They launched a brutal anti-insurgency campaign, one that scorched the countryside. Farms were torched, villages razed. The logic was simple: no food, no guerrillas. Every guerrilla ambush brought retaliation, often against civilians. And in some regions, Chile turned cruelty into a policy. Remember those Chinese slaves that Chile freed from Peruvian masters? Well, they wanted revenge, and Chile gave them the chance. This wasn't looking the other way. This was encouragement. It wasn't pretty, and that was the point. Chile's anti-guerrilla campaign was brutal, and the brutality worked. Over time, General Iglesias began to flinch. He saw that Peru could never defeat Chile, and wanted the dying and destruction to stop. He was willing to sign a peace deal, even if that meant surrendering guano-rich lands. For Chile, Iglesias was the perfect partner, a leader willing to cede land for peace. So Chile shifted its military focus, and turned their guns on the other Peruvian resistance factions. With Chile's help, Iglesias convened a constitutional assembly that declared him president, and one of his first acts as president was signing a peace treaty. In it, Chile permanently annexed the Guano-rich province of Tarapacá. 2 more provinces would remain under Chilean control for 10 years, with a future plebiscite to decide their fate. Despite the treaty, peace never really returned to Peru. With Chile gone, Iglesias and Cáceres continued to fight, engulfing Peru in an ugly civil war. Nonetheless, hostilities between Chile and Peru were finally over, but Bolivia was still on the board. Chile declared that Bolivia's coastline now belonged to them, and there was nothing Bolivia could do about it. Bolivia refused to sign a treaty, of course, but Chilean troops stayed put, holding the coast like it was already theirs, because functionally, it was. It took 25 years, but Bolivia eventually gave in. In 1904, they signed a treaty officially ceding their entire coastline to Chile, and have been landlocked ever since. For Chile, winning the war was better than winning the lottery. In the following years after the war, the Chilean national treasury grew by 900%. Taxes on the guano and nitrates funded over half of government expenditures. But Chile didn't just sit on the windfall. It reinvested heavily. Funding for infrastructure, education, and public works all surged, and it was largely paid for by the spoils of war. Victory launched Chile into a golden age, and cemented its status as a major power in South America. By contrast, Bolivia's defeat was dire, and still echoes to the present. While Chile is one of the richest countries in the region, Bolivia is one of the poorest, a disparity that can be traced to the War of the Pacific. Bolivia has pursued legal avenues to get their old coast back, with the most recent attempt in 2018, but these have all failed. The Bolivians very much remember their lost coast to this day, and have a national holiday called Dia del Mar, Day of the Sea. And for Peru, the war remains a traumatic topic. They got dragged into a war they didn't start, lost resource-rich land, precious works were looted, and the war itself created a new civil war. But there is a silver lining for Peru. The war gave them a stronger sense of nationhood. In that conflict, no one was spared. Rich or poor, indigenous or Spanish, everyone bled. Everyone lost. That shared trauma became a source of patriotism. It is one of the few stories every citizen can claim as their own, because when the dust settled, Peru was still divided in many ways, but also more unified than it had ever been before. This war forever changed South America, and it all began over bird poop. That's all for today. While you're here, the algorithm thinks you'll like this video, and if you enjoyed this, be sure to give it a like. Thank you to all the patrons who keep this channel going.